At 45, he leads the company from the top floor. At 26, he studies business long after everyone sleeps. At 45, the boardroom listens carefully to every word. At 26, he listens more than he speaks. At 45, employees look to him for direction. At 26, he learns from those ahead of him. At 45, the stage lights shine during his speech. At 26, he practices speaking in an empty room. At 45, deals worth millions are signed with confidence. At 26, negotiation begins with small lessons. At 45, the car stops at the company headquarters. At 26, the journey begins on crowded trains. At 45, financial reports decide the future of thousands. At 26, he learns how money truly works. At 45, success is celebrated by the entire team. At 26, late nights build the foundation. At 45, hundreds gather to hear his vision. At 26, he builds confidence one presentation at a time. At 45, he watches the city from the corner office. At 26, he dreams of the skyline from a small room. At 45, cameras record his achievements. At 26, he records his first ideas. At 45, the company floor moves with his leadership. At 26, learning new skills becomes a daily habit. At 45, contracts carry enormous responsibility. At 26, knowledge becomes the first investment. At 45, global partners arrive at his office. At 26, he attends his first networking event. At 45, strategy shapes the future of the company. At 26, strategy begins in a simple notebook. At 45, the media asks about success. At 26, he practices how to communicate clearly. At 45, innovation fills the office halls. At 26, curiosity fills every night. At 45, global expansion becomes reality. At 26, research begins on a laptop screen. At 45, the stock exchange celebrates the company's growth. At 26, the first startup ideas are written down. At 45, investors sit across the table with respect. At 26, he chooses work over distractions. At 45, the executive office reflects success. At 26, success grows in a small rented room. At 45, business travel becomes routine. At 26, preparation begins for future opportunities. At 45, partnerships build powerful networks. At 26, mentors teach the first lessons. At 45, the company headquarters stands tall. At 26, dreams look up at tall buildings. At 45, shareholders trust his leadership. At 26, he learns the language of finance. At 45, awards recognize years of discipline. At 26, discipline quietly shapes every day. At 45, strategy meetings guide the company forward. At 26, plans begin on a simple whiteboard. At 45, employees greet him every morning. At 26, he arrives before everyone else. At 45, the team celebrates major success. At 26, determination replaces comfort. At 45, leadership fills the room. At 26, leadership begins with learning.